The 19th century arrived with a terrible promise. Life in Europe had become burdensome. Cities were growing, factories expanding, crowds increasing. But this growth created more of a burden than a sense of progress. Machines roared to life in the factories of Europe. Peasants abandoned their villages and flooded into cities. Fortunes rose and fell with brutal speed. The old certainties, the aristocracy's divine right, the church's unquestioned authority, the artist's duty to beautify and uplift, crumbled like poorly mortared stone. In the midst of this upheaval, a new voice emerged from the studios of Paris. It was not the voice of dreamers or idealists. It was the voice of those who looked directly at the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. This was the birth of realism. Imagine standing in Paris in 1848. The streets are choked with smoke from burned barricades. The corpses of revolution still lie in the gutters. The old order, it seemed, was finally dying. In these same streets, a painter named Gustave Courbet was asking a dangerous question. What if art stopped lying to us? What if painters stopped showing us gods and heroes, beauty and perfection, and instead showed us the farmers, the laborers, the women bent over washboards, the endless parade of ordinary humanity that made civilization function? The established academies found this idea obscene. The Salon rejected his work. Kings and nobles were horrified. But Courbet refused to apologize. Instead, he rented a warehouse and hung his paintings himself. He called it the Pavilion of Realism. The declaration was simple but revolutionary. Art belongs to the real world, not the world of fantasy. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, you must understand what came before. For centuries, the rules of European art were carved in stone. If you wanted to be a serious artist, you painted myths and legends. You painted saints and martyrs. You painted the aristocracy in their finest clothes, standing in pose, eternally beautiful. You painted hunts and battles and biblical scenes. The world of common people, their work, their poverty, their dignity, was considered beneath art's notice. It was a subject for servants, not for the great galleries. The Romantics had softened this a bit, adding drama and emotion to their canvases. But even the Romantics looked outward to exotic lands and turbulent emotions, rather than inward to the factories and farms of their own time. Courbet and those who followed did something that had never been done before. They looked directly at the people around them. They painted the calloused hands of working men. They painted the exhaustion on the faces of women who had spent 12 hours at a loom. They painted the hunger in the eyes of children in the slums, not with pity, not with condescension, but with the same careful attention to light and shadow, composition and color that the academies had reserved for gods and kings. They were saying something radical. This matters. These people matter. Their lives are worth seeing. Jean-François Millet understood this more deeply than perhaps any other painter of his generation. In the 1850s, Millet turned his eyes to the countryside. He watched the peasants, the men and women who worked the soil, and he painted them. His painting, The Gleaners, shows 3 women in a harvested field, bent low, picking up the leftover grain. There is no drama here, no narrative, just the endless, back-breaking work of the poor. When this painting was displayed in 1857, the reaction was violent. Critics didn't just dislike it, they feared it. One critic, Paul de Saint-Victor, wrote that the women looked like 3 demons of poverty, as if Millet had painted something obscene. What made them so uncomfortable? They realized that Millet had captured something true. He had shown the reality of rural life without softening it, without turning it into a pastoral fantasy. The painting said, "This is what peasant life actually looks like." Another voice that cut through the noise was Honoré Daumier. But Daumier came from a different direction. He began his career as a political cartoonist, drawing biting satires of the powerful for Paris newspapers. His work was so sharp, so dangerous, that he was arrested and imprisoned. But imprisonment did not silence him. When he turned to painting, he carried this spirit with him. He painted the streets of Paris, not the grand monuments, but the ordinary life. He painted workers and beggars, clerks and washerwomen. He painted their exhaustion, their desperation, their dignity. What made Daumier's realism unique was this: he painted with compassion. His work was a cry of outrage at the conditions he witnessed, but it was also an embrace. He was saying, "I see you. Your suffering matters. Your life has meaning." The movement Courbet, Millet, and Daumier started did not remain confined to France. It spread across Europe like a fire finding fresh wood. Each country adapted realism to its own context, its own obsessions. In Russia, a group of artists would take realism and infuse it with a political energy that would eventually transform the nation. These artists called themselves the Wanderers, or Peredvizhniki in Russian. To understand them, you must understand the world they inhabited. In 1863, something remarkable happened at the Imperial Academy of the Arts in St. Petersburg. A group of the Academy's finest students were given the annual competition assignment: paint Odin's entrance into Valhalla. This mythological subject, perfectly acceptable to the Academy's conservative leadership, enraged the students. They looked at this assignment and saw, suddenly, with perfect clarity, what they had been trained to do. They had been trained to paint the fantasies of dead empires, to celebrate myths that had nothing to do with the world outside the Academy walls. Meanwhile, Russia, their Russia, was changing. Peasants were being freed from serfdom. Cities were growing. The nation was asking fundamental questions about itself, about justice, about what kind of society it should become. And the Academy wanted them to paint Odin. 13 painters and 1 sculptor walked out of the Academy. They didn't leave in anger alone. They left with a purpose. They were going to show the Academy and Russia and the world that art belonged to the living, not the dead. Within 7 years, they had formed the Society for Wandering Art Exhibitions. They chose their name carefully. They would not wait for galleries and salons to grace them with acceptance. They would take their art directly to the people. They loaded their paintings into wagons and traveled across Russia, through towns and villages, along rivers and across steppes. They held exhibitions in places that had never seen serious art before. Their message was clear: art is for everyone. The subjects they painted were the heart of Russia. Ilya Repin, the movement's greatest master, painted Volga boatmen, a work that has become the symbol of Russian realism. Here, harnessed like beasts to the heavy barge, men strain against the ropes. Their faces are weathered, marked by years of this same work. The light falls across them with brutal honesty. There is no heroism here, no mythology, just the simple, terrible fact of men selling their labor for bread. This painting shook Russia. Writers like Dostoevsky wrote about it. People recognized their own suffering in it. For the first time, serious art was holding up a mirror to the working classes and saying, "You exist. Your struggle matters. your lives are subjects worthy of the greatest artist's attention. Repin produced other masterworks that cut deeper into the political and social fabric of Russia. The Unexpected Return shows a revolutionary coming home in secret, his wife's face frozen between joy and terror at his return. The arrest of a propagandist captures the moment a young activist is taken into custody, soldiers and civilians crowding around, the light fragmenting across faces of shock and resignation. Repin was painting the great dramas of the 19th century, not the dramas of generals and kings, but the dramas of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. But Repin was not alone. Vasily Perov painted the daily tragedy of Russian life. His A Scene on the Railway shows workers laboring in terrible conditions. His Drowning depicts the suicide of a young woman, pulled from the water, her body broken. These paintings do not comfort, they do not beautify, they confront. Nikolai Bogdanov-Belsky focused his lens on the children of the poor, peasant children in makeshift schools, struggling to learn despite hunger and cold. Konstantin Savitsky painted the repair of railways, showing the brutal cost of Russia's modernization in the bodies of exhausted workers. These artists understood something fundamental. They were not observers of suffering, they were witnesses. And witnessing, they believed, was a form of moral action. The Russian wanderers did something even more radical than painting these subjects. They changed how art was seen. For centuries, the only way to see important art was to enter the great galleries of Moscow or St. Petersburg, to dress properly, to behave with proper decorum. The wanderers rejected this entirely. Their exhibitions traveled. They went where people lived. They hung their paintings into town squares and market halls. They made art available to the very people they painted, to the peasants, the workers, the marginalized. And they did this not from charity, but from conviction. They believed that the people needed to see themselves represented in art, that seeing their own lives and struggles rendered with such care and attention might awaken something in them: consciousness, dignity, the knowledge that their lives mattered. Across Europe, the movement took different forms. In England, artists like Hubert von Herkomer and Frank Holl worked with radical publications to bring realism to the masses. Herkomer, himself a child of German refugees, understood poverty deeply. His paintings of the unemployed on country roads, of immigrants pressing westward, seeking opportunity, of workers on strike. These images shocked the English public. Herkomer believed that art had a social duty. His brush should be used to expose injustice, to make visible what the comfortable classes preferred to ignore. Frank Holl worked with The Graphic, a weekly illustrated magazine founded by a social reformer. Each week, Holl and his colleagues would produce images of social crisis, poverty, crime, illness, injustice. They would then transform these illustrations into large paintings, bringing them to the fine art galleries. Newgate, Committed for Trial, shows a woman and children visiting an imprisoned man, her face a mask of despair. The painting captures not a moment of action, but a moment of loss. In visiting the prison, she enters a tomb. The committed criminal is gone. What remains is the family, destroyed. Critics recognized its power. One wrote that the figures in the painting were so real that you could feel the broken hopes, the shattered domestic ties, the trampled loyalty. This was the power of realism. It did not allow viewers to look away. While all this was happening in Germany, Adolf von Menzel reflected the interiors of factories and ironworks, and the harsh face of the industrial age on his canvas. On the other hand, Wilhelm Leibl did not remain indifferent and depicted village life in a simple and unpretentious style. Thus, from the 1870s onwards, realism split into different schools and movements. Some artists turned to naturalism, a more scientific, almost photographic approach to depicting reality. Others turned to social realism, which explicitly used art as a weapon against injustice. Some painters, particularly in Germany and the United States, distanced themselves somewhat from political involvement and developed realist techniques. However, the fundamental belief remained the same. The primary function of art was to serve truth, not beauty, tradition, or the comfort of patrons. The great irony, of course, is that realism itself became academicized. By the 20th century, particularly after the Russian Revolution, realism was co-opted by state power. Socialist realism became a tool of propaganda, required to depict workers and farmers in heroic poses, showing the triumph of the collective. The very movement that had begun as a rebellion against imposed subjects and official aesthetics became a new orthodoxy. And yet, the spirit that the wanderers had kindled, the belief that art should speak to the conditions of ordinary people, that the lives of the poor and working classes were worthy of the artist's most serious attention, this spirit could never be fully extinguished. What Courbet, Millet, Daumier, Repin, Perov, and their peers understood, in their different ways and contexts, was something that the academies had hidden for centuries, that looking directly at the world as it is, with all its pain, its injustice, its brutal beauty, is the beginning of transformation. Art that tells comfortable lies maintains the status quo, but art that tells difficult truths plants seeds. Viewers who saw themselves in realist paintings, who recognized their own exhaustion, their own dignity, their own struggle, those viewers began to understand themselves differently. They began to see that their lives were not accidental, not meaningless. They were part of a larger pattern. And patterns can be changed. By the end of the 19th century, the world had moved on from realism in the strict sense. Impressionism had captured the light in new ways. Symbolism had retreated into interior worlds. Modernism was beginning to shatter representation itself. But the revolution that realism had accomplished could not be undone. Art had been democratized. The subjects of art had been expanded. The poor, the working, the suffering, these were no longer beneath art's notice. They were, increasingly, art's central concern. And this change, though it may seem small from our vantage point, was seismic. It said once and for all that human dignity was not the property of kings and nobles. It belonged to everyone. And art, if it was to mean anything, had to acknowledge that truth. Something shifts. We are not looking at a representation of a social problem or a political cause. We are looking at a human being. The artist has said, "Look here, see this person. They matter." And in the simple act of looking, truly looking, we become, for a moment, witnesses ourselves. And witnesses, the realists believed, could not remain unchanged. I, Samuel, at Reborn Art, continue to read the spirit of the ages by looking at art movements. At the next stop, we will move on to the moment when light and the moment begin to replace reality.